when I started to try and paint, I always thought I'd have to do some other work. I never expected to sell anything at all. And I've had all sorts of jobs, and I've been helped by different people. I painted because it excited me to try. I wanted to do something that would excite me in painting. One hardly ever arrives at that, but that's what I really wanted to do.
Now in his 82nd year, and still just as excited by the challenge of painting, Francis Bacon could easily be regarded as the grand old man of British art. But his work resists such a cosy establishment title. Although he has exhibited widely for well over 40 years and become instantly recognisable in reproduction, Bacon's paintings continue to provoke a sense of disquiet. His large, arresting canvases concentrate on figures in isolation. Ever since 1945, when he established himself in the first rank by displaying a raspingly powerful work called Three Studies for Figures at the Base of a Crucifixion, the human form has been his obsessive concern. Whether seen in the street or, far more often, in a stark interior lit by a naked bulb, the archetypal Bacon figure is a man alone. Sometimes the figure seems anguished and parts his mouth in a scream. More recently, the people who inhabit his pictures have seemed less disturbed, but Bacon's art remains utterly uncompromising. No one who sees his work can remain indifferent to his preoccupation with the violence of human existence. Bacon has attained a high international standing. When the Tate Gallery honoured him with a second retrospective exhibition in 1985, the director, Sir Alan Bowness, described him as surely the greatest living painter. But Bacon himself, who gave me this rare interview in his Kensington home, resists such accolades.
I don't think in one's lifetime anyone can come round to saying somebody is great, because I think only time will sort things out. And you certainly can't talk about oneself as being great. I think working as I do, I try and work as closely to my instinct as I can, and whether it's any good or not, only time will tell.
Do you think the British understand your work?
There is no such a thing as understanding painting. I mean, I couldn't say that I understand. For instance, when I look at some of the late great Rembrandt self-portraits, I can't say I understand them. I admire them and think they're amongst the most marvellous paintings that have ever been done. But what they really do is unlock all sorts of valves of sensation into other areas. The way that the paint has such enormous implications, the way it was put down and how it was put down.
Do you think, though, that having encountered a considerable amount of hostility during your painting life from the British, do you think that they are finally coming round to your way of seeing?
You see, I think the painting is such a limited instrument. I think very, very few people have really visual contact. They make visual contact, or it excites them. Recently, I mean, the reason that people have become so interested in painting is because they've seen these enormous prices, but they don't mean anything. I think there's so few people that really have a feeling for painting, because painting has not really been a British art. It's not been art of England. If you go to Spain, I think that people, by having had this amazing succession of remarkable paintings, the public are much more aware of painting and what it can do.
That's absolutely right. I mean, there is a difference, and I think that it's to do with the fact that we are essentially a literary culture, isn't it? And you feel that all the time in Britain. It never really seems to change that much.
No, I agree with you. And I think that the literary side, one can begin and end with Shakespeare over that. I don't believe that people even understand a whole lot of Shakespeare, even now.
Strangely, you should talk about a writer like that, because in a way it's quite a complex thing, isn't it? In a way you're a very anti-literary artist. But in another sense, literature means a great deal to you, doesn't it?
Certainly. Especially poetry means an enormous amount to me. And in our own time, or in my time, I always think that it's an astonishing thing to see a man like W.B. Yeats, how he made himself into a very great poet. He started obviously with great gifts. In the last few years of his life, after the wonderful prophetic poem like Second Coming, he made himself into one of the greatest poets of the century.
Could you say that you've been directly inspired by Yeats' poems?
No, I couldn't. But I couldn't have been directly inspired by the poems of anybody. But their astonishing quality is in itself, I don't know whether it's a help, but it just makes you conscious of the possibilities of things.
But there is one triptych you painted, isn't there, which is pinned down by its title to T.S. Eliot.
It wasn't pinned down by me. It was pinned down by the Marlborough Gallery.
Oh, really?
Yes, I certainly never called it that. They asked me how did this come about, and I said I'd been reading recently The Wasteland, and of course, wanting to do, but I never called it any of that at all.
So you're unhappy about the fact that it has
Yes,
Eliot?
I certainly am. As much as I like Eliot and admire Eliot.
On the other hand, there are some titles of your paintings which are attached to the Greek tragedies, aren't there? Do you object to that as well?
I do, really, because I don't think names... You see, I've only been able to read the Oresteia in translation, unfortunately, but it's something that has meant an enormous amount to me.
How do you think that book fed your imagination? I mean, why do you think you were so stimulated by it?
How does one know about anything? Anything. You can see an advertisement, you can see something lying in the street. Anything can stimulate and excite you about wanting to do something. It doesn't have to be a great or remarkable thing, it can be just anything. Anything lying on the floor or anything. You see, when I start painting, I have an idea of what I'd like to do, but generally the accidents in the paint suggest the possibilities of developing the image in a way which seemed to be very much better than anything I had thought of.
And are you often surprised by what accidents can do to painting? Pleasantly surprised?
Anything that helps me at all, I'm surprised at. But of course it's, and I know that in my case, that anyway, what I consider is the things that are a bit better have come about really by the accidental movement of the brush.
You like starting very early in the morning, don't you?
Well, that's just the habit. Some people like the afternoon or the evenings or the night after early morning.
But I do find it interesting because you get up around 6 o'clock, don't you?
Yes.
And you start fairly swiftly, do you? Or...
Yes, I have a cup of tea or something like that myself.
And I also know that you don't, as a general rule, like the whole idea of painting from the life, do you? You like to operate it at a remove from that.
I do, yes, myself, certainly I do.
I think there have been certain occasions when you've painted portraits, for example, from people, but on the whole, you'd like to work from photographic sources.
Well, I like to work, I like people that I know well, and I know them visually well when it comes down to portraits, but really, I've done very few portraits.
Of the portraits that you've done, would you actually say to somebody, I'd quite like to have some photographs of you, or I'd quite like to take some photographs of you and use those?
I do very often have photographs of people, but...
And how would you go about using them? Would you pin them up in the studio?
No, well, they're just like a reference. Ideally, one would just like to pick up a lump of paint and throw it at the canvas, and there was the marvelous likeness. The whole thing was there.
It doesn't quite work like that, does it?
Unfortunately not, no.
And also, in a way, you're not that kind of artist, are you? Because on the one hand, you like the idea of impulse and accident, but on the other hand, I think you're a very immaculate painter, strangely enough.
I'd like a very, very ordered chaos.
So I've always been very intrigued by the fact that you don't seem to make any drawings before you start. You don't seem to, and some of your triptychs are very complicated, but you don't seem to feel the need to plot them before you begin the act of painting.
Well, I think drawing, I mean, I love other people's drawings, many other people's drawings, but for instance, you were talking about some of Picasso's drawings, but his drawings and his paintings are totally different things. The drawing is a thing, very often a wonderful thing in itself, but it's a totally different thing when it is translated into paint.
And yet the strange thing about your work is that in some senses they are quite linear, your paintings, aren't they?
I think they are, yes.
So isn't it strange that you don't draw?
I think it's because I can't draw.
I find that quite hard to believe looking at your paintings, actually.
No, well, I don't think I can draw. I mean, I don't think if you ask me to draw something, I don't think I would be able to. And I mean, very often people have said that, well, he can't draw, so there it is. So, I mean, that's why they're so awful painting. I can show you a photograph of the new triptych. I can only show you one panel of it, because I've redone the 2 other panels. Well, you know, stuff photographs don't give you much idea.
Well, we're looking at a painting where a large part of the surface is very plain, almost austere. It's a kind of beige colour, isn't it, around the lower part of the composition. And then in the upper half, there's this strange pair of legs that should, of course, lead up to the rest of the body, but instead there's a head.
I put a photograph.
Oh, that actually is a photograph.
It is. Well, it's not, but it's a painted photograph.
And it's a photograph of yourself?
Taken many years ago.
The young Francis Bacon.
Well, younger.
And he seems to be balancing, doesn't he, in a strange way, on top of the trunk of these naked legs.
Yes. You see, that's the reason you can't talk about it.
And actually, the legs themselves are not as convulsive as they have been in your work. And that's something I've noticed.
Well, I never think about my work as convulsive sort of thing.
But it's something that I have noticed actually about your more recent work, is that it is calmer perhaps, more ordered than it once was.
But you see, I like very ordered work.
Yes, you're much more, I mean, you went to see the Seurat show recently, I guess.
Yes.
Yes. And he interests you, doesn't he?
Well, of course, I mean, I think that's absolutely superb. Of course, he died so young that one doesn't know what he would have done, but I think it's absolutely astonishing what he did. But I think the sketches are the most beautiful thing.
But with someone like that, where order is supreme, don't you ever feel, being the artist that you are, that there's something missing? Because after all, people would never feel disturbed when they look at the Seurat Bagnard. But your work is disturbing, in some cases profoundly disturbing, and it deals, for example, with a kind of violence and the experience of violence, which plays no part in an artist like Seurat, does it?
Yes, but presumably the period that you lived through. I was born in 1909, and I lived through the First World War, and then with all the things that had happened between the First World War, the Russian Revolution, and the Second World War. I mean, one lived through a time of chaos, in a sense, and I think that does affect one's way of feeling about things and one's way of...
I'm sure you're right. Do you have any particular memories of the First World War?
I was only, born in 1909, I was 5, and I remember my father, I was in Ireland then, telling us the war had started, and then we came to London because he was working in the War Office or something of that kind here. I don't really remember the raids. I remember curious things that they used to do, like we lived near Kensington Gardens. They used to out of watering cans, they used to spray the grass with phosphorescent, thinking of the Zeppelins at sea. I think that that's for the lights of London, and the bombs would be dropped on Hyde Park or Kensington Gardens or something. It's a mad idea.
You can't imagine that it works, can you?
I don't suppose it did at all. But then I don't think air warfare in 1914 wasn't as efficient as it became in 1940. But at that age, of course, you're not as aware as one is during, for instance, the last war. I'm an asthmatic, and because of that, I was turned down and was put into a thing called a rescue service in Chelsea. And of course, one did see then the effects of these people in an appalling state very often after bombardment.
What, you actually had to help pull people out of wrecked
Yes,
buildings?
exactly.
But you never actually tried to paint that kind of experience in a direct way, have you?
Well, just look at when people have, how bad it is.
And presumably, I mean, one of the things that informed your triptych, your 1944 triptych, that was so important, such a landmark in your work, really, isn't it? One of the things that informed that must have been the experience of war, the idea of these three strangely deformed figures at the base of a crucifixion.
No, I intended to do the crucifixion, but I think that those really, they came out of the Picasso paintings, the beautiful images to be made on the beach, on beaches, and I think it came out of his influence on me, of those things. But they were more to do, I think, with his love of the beauty of the imagery to me, and may have been with the beauty of the girl he picked up, and those things in a sense were around that rounded beauty.
And they're very erotic, aren't they, as well as...
They're very erotic and...
distorted.
Yes.
Would you say that of some of your work, that it has an erotic impulse?
I don't know, really. I don't know.
I do get the feeling myself when I look at certain of your images, by no means all of them, but I do get the feeling with some of them that the erotic feeling in them is very strong.
It would be a different eroticism, wouldn't it? As I'm homosexual, the eroticism is of a different type.
Yes, absolutely. But there are very often quite specific references, aren't there, to figures embracing in beds. The act of making love is very often painted, isn't it, in your work?
Yes, that it is, yes.
That's actually a very brave thing for you to do, I always think, because when you started work as an artist, the whole climate in this country was very much against the whole idea of homosexuality even being mentioned, let alone put in...
But then it still is, and it probably always will be. But there's a natural feeling that after all, homosexuality, the human race is not going on with homosexuality. Because in a sense it's a dead end.
One, at least, of the recurring images of figures who seem to be making love or struggling or embracing, whatever they're doing, derives, in fact, from a photograph by Muybridge, doesn't it, of wrestlers?
It does. And I'd seen some photographs of Muybridge, and then somebody who used to be a friend of mine, called Ennisworth Miller, he discovered that you could see the whole of Muybridge in the Victorian Albus. The thing about it, he wanted to make a record of human movement, because I've always been fascinated by the human body, and therefore that this was a dictionary of it. And coming back to this thing of the wrestlers, it would be hard. I mean, you've only got to go a point further, and you could say that the love act is a form of wrestling. So with wrestlers, it's very simple to turn it into an erotic image. What the wrestlers themselves felt, one has no idea.
Mind you, you have drawn in other paintings from highly emotive works of art, you can call them. I'm thinking in particular of the Eisenstein, which is photographed in one sense, but of course it's a film still from the Battleship Potemkin film?
Because I've seen things like that when I was young. I think I would have tried to make films rather than being a painter, perhaps, because I think the possibilities in the film are so enormous. But of course, the problems of money, the people finance them think that they know what the public wants, that kind of thing. Whereas I think the public wants something far, far more complicated than the people who put up the money for it too.
What was it about that Eisenstein image that really interested you? Because we're talking about, aren't we, the face of a nurse,
yes,
with a pince nez hanging down from her nose, there's blood on her face, and she's screaming.
She's screaming, and Eisenstein had such remarkable visual sense that, I mean, when you see the plan hurtling down these steps, it was just an extraordinary image, one of the greatest images that have been made.
What was it about the scream in the nurse's face that interested you? Because the scream was, for a long time anyway, maybe not so much now, very important to you, wasn't it, in your work?
Well, you see, I never succeeded in doing what I wanted with the scream. I always thought that I could make the scream as beautiful as some of those late morning landscapes. What I would like to, I thought that with the lips and the tongue and the teeth, one could have done it, but I didn't succeed in doing it.
And above all, your attempts to succeed centred on the Velázquez portrait of Pope Innocent, didn't they?
Yes.
A portrait.
Because there are things that I really hate now, and I just wish, well, I suppose one regrets so many things, but I just think it was only a form, in a way, of sensationalism that it never really worked.
It's a very harsh thing to say about your own work, isn't it?
Well, I mean, if you can't be harsh about your own work, what else can you be harsh about?
Do you think you're your own severest critic?
I wouldn't say severest, because my work is really not liked at all, generally speaking.
Would you say that?
I think so.
Well, how would you account for the fact that it now sells for what? Several £1 million per picture?
Firstly, there are practically no good painters around of any. I mean, I'm not suggesting by that saying that I'm a good painter, but there are painters of really no quality practically at all around. And the other thing is that I don't know how the market is manipulated by the dealers.
But this interests me very much that you say your work is not liked. I mean, upon what do you base that statement? From what people have said, written, or what?
Sometimes people do come up and say that they like it and that kind of thing, but this is very nice. I'm not always very pleased if anybody does like the things. But I'm not a painter who's liked in the way that, for instance, a painter like Hockney is liked.
Yes, you're almost the antithesis, really, of Hockney, aren't you? Because Hockney is an artist who, I mean, he would be the first to confess it, I'm sure, cannot actually deal with the darker side of life in his work.
But then am I dealing with the darker side of life? I'm only dealing with what life is itself.
But you can't deal with the, as it were, the Hockney side of life, can you?
But I don't really want to. I mean, what is the Hockney side of life?
I suppose you would sum it up by saying it was to do with the idea of celebration, a feeling of well-being.
I mean, I would like to celebrate things, and I always think I do, but then there comes into it the neurosis of my century and of the time in which I've been lived and grown up and existing.
You can't ignore that, can you, in your own work? I mean, it would be dishonest of you.
I don't want to ignore it, you see, because I think it's just part of the very texture of our existence.
But you're not at all downcast by it, are you?
No, I'm not. I have a very optimistic nature, but I'm optimistic about nothing, because I don't believe in anything. I just believe I'm nothing to be optimistic about. But I am naturally optimistic. That just is a quirk of nature.
Well, maybe the whole idea of having nothing to believe in is for you a curious kind of emancipation, isn't it? It's a sort of relief.
But I never have believed in anything. You see, as children, we were brought up as Protestants in Ireland and taken to church every day. It took me through until the age of about 17 when I suddenly realized that the whole thing was just an absolute farce and that one just had one's moments of life and that's it. And yet I do remember when it came to me, when I suddenly realized how I did also feel, well, to come immediately to the knowledge that life had no meaning except the meaning that what certain people have done through their inventions or the images or the amazing things that they have done. But the life in itself has no other meaning than that.
Is that what drives you, do you think? That ambition to, in a way, make something out of nothing?
I can only say I don't know that when I started to paint, I tried, you see, I didn't start till very late. I didn't start till I was nearly 30. Painting really had excited me, began to excite me. I think it began to excite me really after I had seen exhibitions of Picasso when I'd been in Paris. And I think it was his work, although not the work of that period, I don't happen to like at all, but it was somehow the excitement of that started me wanting to try and paint myself.
But the urge to paint is clearly just as strong now in your life.
Stronger. The nearer to death I am, the stronger it gets.
You think it's stronger now?
Yes, I do.
Really? Why do you think that?
I've no idea, but I just feel more inventive in a way.
But that's one of the things about painting, isn't it? That it's something that you can actually go on doing until you drop, it seems to me.
That's what I certainly hope I'll go on like I'm dead. Yes, I would like to be.
Do you fear the prospect of death at all?
Fear? I've got nothing to fear about it because as I believe in absolutely nothing, I know I just won't exist. Of course, it'll be horrible knowing that you're leaving everything, that everything has meant things to you.
It seems to me that looking at your work, though, you've always been unusually aware of death, should I say. It's almost as if you're a man who enjoys life so much and relishes it so much that sometimes mortality offends you in some way. You don't like the idea of it all ending, do you?
No, of course I don't like the idea of it ending, but I notice. But then, after all, if you really love life, if things excite you, you're walking with the shadow of its opposite. You're walking with the shadow of death all the time. I mean, and the more you love life, the more conscious you are, perhaps, of death.
And shadows recur in your paintings, don't they?
They do. I don't know a great many shadows, though. Yes, they do.
But when they appear, do you think that they are, in a way, to do with intimations of mortality?
No, I don't. I think they're entirely to do with the layout of the painting.
I knew you'd say that. The curious thing is, I don't feel that I'm talking to an 8-year-old at all.
I'm very old. I'm an 80-year-old. You're talking to somebody over 80.
I know. I mean, you're old on paper, but to meet you and to talk to you, it's quite uncanny.
Yes, but I don't think that. I don't think there's. I mean, obviously, one's body decays and everything, but as long as the brain doesn't decay too much, at least, there's no reason that one should bother too much about age.